Our next item on the agenda this morning is an evidence session on housing and homelessness, with a particular focus on asylum seekers and refugees. I welcome to the meeting Graham O'Neill, Policy Manager, Scottish Refugee Council, and Phil Arnold, Head of Refugee Support for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, for British Red Cross. So we will now move to the questions, and I'm going to invite Jeremy in. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good morning. Thank you both for coming along this morning. If I can open up with a fairly general question, that is, how do you think the wider dispersal of asylum seekers across Scotland will impact on individuals and families when granted refugee status? And Phil, do you want to go first, and then maybe Graham?
Sure, thanks. And thanks very much for creating the opportunity to give evidence today. The British Red Cross is the largest independent provider of support for refugees and people seeking asylum in the UK. And over the last 5 years, we've supported just over 11,000 people in Scotland, of which about half of people have been destitute at different points in Scotland. We also undertake surveys, and over the past couple of years we've surveyed about 1,700 people seeking asylum and refugees, and safe housing has been the largest priority that has come up for people time and time again during those surveys. So I really welcome the opportunity of giving some evidence and to talk through today. When it comes to looking at dispersal across Scotland, fundamentally we support a community-based dispersal model that enables people to integrate from day one, that empowers communities, that creates a space where people can connect, where they can start life after having experienced persecution and trauma and torture in other countries and conflict. The process of expanding dispersal from Glasgow across different local authorities holds a whole range of different questions around whether there's infrastructure in those places, around what people's experiences are in the asylum system prior to getting refugee status and starting life in those places. And we have some concerns around that. There's a couple of points that I just wanted to flag. I guess the first is around institutionalisation of accommodation and what that means in Scotland at the moment. And the second is also just talking specifically around some of the experiences of age dispute. Where these become important is when you're thinking about expanding dispersal across Scotland, there needs to be an effective planning framework and a strategic framework for enabling that infrastructure to move across. If there isn't that, gaps will appear and people will experience challenge and difficulties throughout the asylum system. And so at the point in which they get refugee status and start life again, they're already on the back foot and have already experienced a lot of different issues inside that. Over the sort of last couple of years, we've seen the growth of hotel, for example, hotel growth across Scotland grow. Our casework support between 20 and 21 and 22-23 has increased over 900% in terms of the amount of casework support. It started at a fairly low level, and now it's supporting over 250 people who are in hotels. What we see inside that place is a lot of changing support needs for people who are emerging. We see over double the support needs around clothing. We see an increase in destitution and a need for cash inside those places. There's also particular age considerations. So for clients who are over 65, we're seeing a higher percentage of health needs that are emerging inside hotel accommodation. For children who are in hotels, we're seeing significant prevalence of additional support needs inside those situations. And so during all of that process, if people aren't getting the support during that process, then when they're coming out of that towards moving into getting refugee status, it's going to cause particular issues. And I also just want to talk about age dispute young people in Scotland, because part of expanding dispersal is also there's an element which is different from supporting people on Ukraine, which is different from supporting people around who've come through an Afghan relocation programme, for example. And some of that is about the technical challenge of engaging with the asylum process. And there really needs to be an effective capacity building programme to enable local authorities and to work around that. So last year we wrote to the convener of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civic Justice Committee to highlight that over the last few years the Red Cross had supported 39 young people who were wanting to challenge their age in Scotland, either through the local authority or because of Home Office practice. And of those, 82 young people were found to be children. They fell through the gaps of protection in Scotland and were living independently throughout for a prolonged period of time. Last year, the Red Cross supported 44 young people, 32 of which were also age-disputed young people. In that situation, what we found was that for those young people, for 20 of those cases, it required both legal intervention and as well as the Red Cross to highlight the challenges of the age assessment process. Out of those, 85% was looking at judicial review against local authorities about that decision-making process. On average, it took 11 weeks for those young people for the local authority to agree to undertake an age assessment. And during that period of time, people weren't provided with accommodation and support. So in an acute situation, what we saw was 2 young people, and it took over 2 years to get the local authority to undertake an age assessment. We have young people in that situation who have lived in hotels, in hotels for over 100 men, for example. At that point, there's a real sort of area about looking at what it means from an element of protection inside Scotland. And inside the institutional accommodation settings, where you compare an age-disputed young person to a child outside of a hotel, there's a higher prevalence of responses that the Red Cross has been required around trafficking risks, around suicide ideation for young people, around safeguarding issues, all very prevalent with inside institutional accommodation settings. And so we have significant concerns around, there needs to be the infrastructure in place to enable that dispersal to take place across Scotland.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if Graham wants to come in.
Yeah, would you be okay to repeat the question, actually? Thank you.
I think I probably should say, if we could keep our answers reasonably tight, or the convener's going to get stroppy with you. So I warn you now. How do you think the wider dispersal of asylum seekers across Scotland will impact on individuals and families who are granted refugee status?
Okay, well, I suppose first of all we would associate ourselves with what Phil has just articulated to the committee, so I'll try not to kind of go over the ground that Phil's really well covered. Secondly, just to say on behalf of Scottish Refugee Council, again, we're really grateful to the committee for devoting time and space for this. It's not lost on us that you're doing that, and you've been doing it for a number of years alongside particularly the Equality and Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. The people out there really that are in the refugee protection system can often, in our experience, be rendered invisible by UK government systems, and it's important in this Parliament through the committees that we get visibility and voice, and you do that alongside the Equality, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. As Phil said, we are at Scottish Refugee Council also for a community-based approach for the accommodation and support for people seeking granted and refused refugee protection. In our experience, there's been a real systemic change and institutionalisation of the accommodation arrangements across the UK, including in Scotland, of asylum seekers. And we know there's about 1,400 people, as I speak just now, in 17 hotels, or what we would call ex-hotels, in Scotland across 13 local authority areas. And people are kind of living a very kind of Spartan, poverty-laden and often socially isolating experience, which, as the evidence is covered, does a lot of harm to people's mental health and well-being. And that's despite, obviously, a lot of really good support from often local charities and community groups who kind of step in where the state has been retreating. So that's a kind of serious trend that we're witnessing across the UK, including Scotland, this institutionalisation. As others have covered in previous committee reports, there's a question about who's benefiting from all of this. We think there's a real perversity in the fact that it's private companies that are benefiting huge amounts of money, public money, to accommodate people in what is often not good accommodation for them, or also for local communities either. And from that, we start to see a kind of weakening in the confidence and support sometimes for asylum and refugee protection. And we stand that in contrast to the not perfect but generally good experience in Glasgow over 20 years, where there's been a kind of pride taken in Glasgow around having and being enriched by people seeking refugee protection and contributing as part of the rebuilding their own lives process in that. As Phil said, there's huge challenges because so much of the asylum system operates through private companies, private contracts. So much of it's done to local areas as opposed to done with them. Most of the funding, as I say, goes to private companies, doesn't go to local authorities at all, or refugees, or local communities. It doesn't need to be like this, but it is at the moment like this. I just wanted to flag up before I talk about this particular impact on individuals and families in terms of granted refugee status, because I know that's the focus of the question. You know that the asylum accommodation contracts across the UK are 10-year contracts, premised at £4 billion over that 10-year period, 2019 to 2029. They have a renegotiation clause that takes effect if it was used from 2026. We would hope and expect that Scottish ministers would instigate an overdue discussion about the use of that renegotiation clause, as well as this committee, to the Home Secretary, because at the moment nobody's talking about it, despite the fact that everybody is talking about the gross waste of public money going to private companies and not getting much back from it in terms of wider social outcomes. So that renegotiation clause needs to be put front and centre, we say, of the next two elections.